Dear students, we till now we have learnt about the impacts of disasters, of climate change, of extreme weather events. We know that the impacts have been severe, and the cities would further get affected due to due to disasters and due to climate change. Internationally, there have been initiatives in the field of disaster risk reduction and climate change. So we will first start with disaster risk reduction. We will learn about the international initiatives in disaster risk reduction, which includes the initiatives by various organizations in terms of landmark conferences, in terms of guidelines which are set forth to mitigate disaster risk or to reduce disaster risk. So we will learn about that, and also the various programs that are put forth over a period of time by the various organizations at the international level. The decade 1989, starting from 1989 to 1999, was earmarked as the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction by United Nations, with the basic objective of decreasing the loss of life, destruction of property, reduction of social and economic disruption caused by natural disasters. In this time period, a very important conference, a landmark conference on disaster risk reduction, happened in Yokohama in 1994, which provided guidelines, natural disaster prevention, preparedness, and mitigation. The Yokohama strategy and the plan of action for a safer world identified 10 points, which included risk assessment, disaster prevention and preparedness. It said that disaster prevention and preparedness should be considered as integral aspects of development policy and planning at various levels, from national to regional to bilateral, multilateral, and international level. It put forth the necessity for development and strengthening of capacities, of early warnings of impending disasters and their effective dissemination, about preventive measures, and that preventive measures are most effective when they involve participation at all levels, about application of proper design and patterns of development focused on target groups in order to reduce the vulnerability, and the need for sharing necessary technology for disaster risk reduction. The strategy further states that environmental protection has to be consistent with poverty alleviation so as to prevent and mitigate natural disasters, mitigation of the impacts of the natural disasters. And each country should be responsible for protecting its people, infrastructure, and national assets from the natural disaster. In 1999, United Nations came up or formulated the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, which is an international framework for responding to the challenges presented to the international community by the increasing incidence and scale of disasters. Simultaneously, UNISDR, that is United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, was formed to serve as the focal point in the United Nations system for the coordination of disaster reduction and to ensure synergies among the disaster reduction activities of the UN system and regional organizations and activities in the socio-economic and humanitarian fields. UNISDR coordinates the global platform for disaster risk reduction. The World Summit on Sustainable Development that was held in Johannesburg in 2002 noted that an integrated multi-hazard inclusive approach is an essential element for a safer world so as to address vulnerability, risk assessment, and disaster management, including prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. The Johannesburg Plan of Implementation provided UNISDR, that is United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, and the Interagency Task Force with a concrete set of objectives for integrating and mainstreaming risk reduction into development policies and processes. This was a very significant step because it brought in the importance of mainstreaming risk reduction in development policies and processes. While Yokohama Conference was the first world conference on disaster reduction, the second world conference on disaster reduction was held in Kobe, and a Hyogo framework for action was the outcome of this conference. And the outcome of this conference was the Hyogo framework for action for the decade starting from 2005 to 2015. The conference was all about building the resilience of nations and communities to disasters, and spelled out that disaster risk reduction needs to be used as a foundation for sound national and international development agenda. The framework for action put forth a framework for implementability by specifying a few aspects for the nations, that is identification of the national and priority aspects, national and local priority aspects, then assessment of the risks, then knowledge and education, then reduction of the vulnerability and disaster preparedness. Because the yoga framework was about a framework for action, that means about implementation mechanism. So therefore three organizations were formulated with an aim to implement this framework. And one was International Recovery Platform, which was a thematic platform of the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction System was formed, which was a key pillar for the implementation of this framework. A global facility for disaster risk reduction was launched by the World Bank together with major donors and the United Nations in 2006 so as to support the implementation of this framework, of the Yoga framework. Thirdly, the Asian Disaster Reduction Center was established with a mission to enhance disaster resilience of the member countries, to build safe communities, and to create sustainable societies. After, in 2007, the first session of the Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction was held in order to support the implementation of the Hyogo framework for action, allowing government representatives, non-governmental organizations, scientists, practitioners, private sector, various UN organizations to share experiences, identify remaining gaps, formulate strategic guidance, and give advice for the implementation for the framework for action. In 2012, the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, commonly referred to as Rio Plus 20, contains a section on disaster risk reduction that sets a firm foundation for discussions on a post 2015 framework to continue guiding the nations after the Yoga framework expired. The third United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction was held in Sendai, and the action period for this Sendai framework is earmarked to be 15 years, that is from 2015 to 2030. And the Sendai framework is the successor instrument to the Hyogo framework for action, which was for the decade of 2005 to 2015. And the four priorities of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction included understanding disaster risk, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk, and enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And 7 global targets were identified which focused on, or which had the focus areas of reduction of mortality, of affected people, of economic loss, and reduction of the damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services. As part of the 7 global targets, many initiatives were earmarked to be increased. One is increase in the number of countries with national as well as local disaster risk reduction strategies, then international cooperation, then increase in the international cooperation, and increase in the availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and assessments. The United Nations General Assembly in 2015 put forth or set the agenda for sustainable development for 2030, and it recognizes and reaffirms the urgent need to reduce the risk of disasters. Out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were put forth, many of the goals had disaster risk reduction or aspects related to disaster risk reduction, aspects related to resilience in or as part of their targets. As you can see, Goal 1 was about ending poverty, and the target identified the nations need to, or nations or at the local level, the resilience of the poor and those in vulnerable situations need to be built up so that their exposure and vulnerability to climate related extremes and other disasters reduce. The second goal was about ending hunger, achieving food security, and the target says that sustainable food production systems should be ensured and resilient agricultural practices should be implemented that increase productivity and production, but also strengthening of the capacity for adaptation to climate change, extreme weather, drought, flooding, and other disasters. Goal 3 was about ensuring healthy lives and about promoting well-being. The target which was mentioned is about initiating or strengthening the capacity for early warning systems, risk reduction, and management of risks. Goal 4, which is about ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education, put forth the target which speaks about ensuring that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development. The knowledge and skill would also empower or enable the citizens and the communities to safeguard themselves from risks. The goal 6 talks about sustainable management of water and sanitation, and the targets are the related target to disaster risk reduction is about protection and restoration of water related ecosystems, including mountains, forests, wetlands, rivers, aquifers, lakes, all are water resources. Goal 9 is about building resilient infrastructure, promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Two targets had been identified for this goal, which is related to risk reduction, which is about developing quality, reliable, sustainable, and resilient infrastructure. Because this is very important, as various infrastructure are identified as critical infrastructure, which we would learn in the forthcoming module. What is critical infrastructure? So therefore, this target, which talks about developing quality, reliable, sustainable, and resilient infrastructure, becomes very important. And the next target is about facilitating sustainable and resilient infrastructure development in developing countries. Goal 11 is about cities. Goal 11 talks about making the cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And this is a very significant goal because it relates to the urban development, which we have seen how it's getting impacted, and and about the vicious cycle and how it had impacted how it had also triggered of disaster risks. The targets which have been identified is about significantly reducing the number of deaths and the number of people affected, decreasing the economic losses, protecting the poor and the people in vulnerable situations. And another target talks about talks about implementing integrated policies and plans towards inclusion, resource efficiency, mitigation, and adaptation to climate change, resilience to disasters. And the next target talks about a holistic disaster risk management at all levels, in coherence with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which would focus on adopting and implementing integrated policies and plans towards inclusion, resource efficiency, mitigation, and adaptation to climate change and resilience to disasters. The third target talks about providing support to the least developed countries through financial and technical assistance in building sustainable and resilient buildings. So we have seen how various international initiatives in terms of very significant and landmark conferences that have put forth the framework for action, and the rather implementation was focused, that in the various frameworks, and which needs to be adopted by at the national level and at the local level by various nations. So these initiatives give us a direction of leading our cities towards resilient development and overcoming the or reducing the risk, disaster risk.